Buckle up, folks, because today we're taking a deep dive into the mind of a philosopher who wasn't afraid to stare into the abyss and tell us exactly what he saw. That's right, we're talking about Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism.
Oh, yeah, Schopenhauer. The guy who basically said life is just bouncing back and forth between being bored and being in pain. Not exactly a cheery outlook.
Not exactly, no. But hey, that's why we're here, right? To delve into these complex, maybe even uncomfortable ideas. We've got excerpts from a few different texts about his life and his philosophy, and we're going to try to figure out what makes his pessimistic worldview tick, and, more importantly, why it resonated with so many people, even today.
Absolutely. And we're going to explore a lot of ground here. We'll look at the thinkers who influenced Schopenhauer, like Kant, Plato, and some of the ideas from Hindu philosophy. We'll unpack his most famous work, The World as Will and Representation. And of course, we'll get into some of the, shall we say, interesting details of his personal life, because those definitely shaped his thinking.
To kick things off, let me throw a question out to you listeners. Have you ever felt that kind of deep down dissatisfaction, like a nagging sense that happiness is fleeting and struggle is just the default setting? If so, Schopenhauer's ideas might offer some, well, let's say unsettling insights.
I think to really grasp Schopenhauer, we need to set the stage a bit. Take a quick glance at the philosophical landscape before he came along. The text mentions how modern philosophy really got rolling with Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. Descartes questioned everything, but when it came to actually rebuilding knowledge, he kind of walked it back a bit. Then along came the British empiricist Locke, Berkeley, and Hume.
The empiricists, right, those were the folks who were all about how all our knowledge comes from experience.
Exactly. And Hume really pushed that idea to the limit, to the point where he almost demolished the whole idea of making any solid philosophical conclusions. It was almost as if he reduced everything to just a bunch of random sensations.
And that's where Kant enters the picture, right? He famously said he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber by Hume. And what a way to wake up. He took on empiricism but wasn't intimidated at all. He went on to build this huge philosophical system trying to bridge rationalism and empiricism.
Precisely. And then we had Hegel with his own massive system, which Schopenhauer, and I'm quoting here, called a monstrosity, treated with deserved contempt. Schopenhauer was much more aligned with Kant's view of how we understand the world, the whole epistemology thing.
Epistemology, right. How we know what we know.
Right. But there was a huge difference between them when it came to morality.
Yep.
Kant built this whole system of morality with his belief in a moral foundation of the world. There's that famous quote, supposedly his last words, "It is good." And in his final work, he wrote that passage about the starry heavens above and the moral law within, filling the soul with ever-increasing wonder and awe. But Schopenhauer, as the text really emphasizes, saw things very, very differently.
Very differently indeed. And this is where Schopenhauer's personality really shines through, for better or worse.
Yeah.
The text is pretty frank about him being, well, unpleasant. But at the same time, it acknowledges that his writing is incredibly powerful, even comparing his style to Plato. And his philosophy was just as magnetic. He's considered the first philosopher since Socrates whose work is so closely tied to his actual personality.
Absolutely. It's like when you read Schopenhauer, you can almost picture him right there with you. Though we do have to keep in mind that what comes across as insightful and witty on the page might have been, well, sarcastic, selfish, and even aggressive in real life.
There's that old saying, right? Actors off the stage are not always noted for their human qualities. Seems like it might apply to Schopenhauer.
Definitely. And his personality really ties into his whole pessimism thing. But it's important to understand that he wasn't saying the world is out to get us. More like he saw the universe as indifferent to our fate. It's sort of similar to the Stoic idea of detachment. But Schopenhauer's approach was, as the text puts it, much more combative and profane. And then there's the paradox of him advocating for this kind of self-denial, but living a pretty comfortable life himself, enjoying his privileges, though he did consider himself an ascetic. But, hey, these contradictions might be part of what made him so popular, People can relate to that kind of complexity.
Speaking of his life, there are some pretty interesting tidbits in the text. He was born in Danzig, son of a merchant from an aristocratic family, and a mother whose artistic ambitions were kind of stifled. The family was pretty cosmopolitan, and he traveled a lot around Europe as a young man. He saw firsthand the misery of the Napoleonic Wars, which must have really shaped his outlook on the world. And his relationship with his mother, Johanna Schopenhauer, who became a bit of a star in the literary salons and a friend of Goethe, was, well, tense is putting it mildly. Clashing personalities, jealousy of her success, The text even suggests there might have been some Oedipal stuff going on there.
Sounds like a complicated family dynamic.
You could say that.
And all of these life experiences set the stage for his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation. That title alone is so key to understanding his philosophy. He's building on Kant's idea that the world we perceive is just representation, phenomena. But Schopenhauer takes it a step further and argues that what underlies this representation isn't Kant's noumenon, but this universal will.
And this will, according to Schopenhauer, is blind, aimless, it's in everything, beyond space and time, and it has no cause. And get this, it's this will that's the source of all the misery and suffering in the world, which only ends, according to him, in death. Kind of a bummer, right?
Not exactly uplifting, but he doesn't leave us completely in the dark. He offers 3 paths to liberation from this will: compassion for others who are suffering, asceticism, which is basically renouncing your own will, and aesthetic appreciation, which is contemplating art without desire.
It's interesting, though, because there's this apparent contradiction between him advocating for this kind of renunciation and living a comfortable bourgeois life himself, enjoying good food and even joking about how his brain was bigger than average.
Right. But for him, that appreciation of beauty was constant, whether it was in literature, music, visual arts, or theater. He had very strong opinions about art, with music at the top of his hierarchy and architecture at the bottom.
And the initial reception of the world as will and representation wasn't exactly a warm embrace. The text mentions that most of the first edition ended up as waste paper. His reaction to that indifference was pretty classic. He said, would a musician feel flattered by the loud applause of his audience if he knew that they were nearly all deaf? He also tried to lecture at the University of Berlin at the same time as Hegel, but no one showed up to his lectures. Talk about a blow to the ego.
Must have been a pretty frustrating time for him. But Schopenhauer's persistence paid off eventually. Decades after his main work was published, he got a positive review in the Westminster Review in England, which actually struck interest back in Germany. And suddenly, in his later years, he became famous. Even with this late-in-life recognition, he maintained his eccentricities, like his obsession with noise. And he published Parerga and Paralipomena, which was a collection of more accessible essays and aphorisms. This work had a surprisingly modern sensibility, despite some pretty controversial opinions, particularly about women. There's this interesting mix of conservatism, anarchic elements, and this kind of sarcastic egoism.
And this late fame not only solidified his place in history, but also showed the profound impact his ideas had on so many thinkers and artists. We're talking Wagner, Freud, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Burckhardt, Thomas Mann, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Thomas Bernhard, the list goes on.
Yeah, they all took something different from him, but for many of them, Schopenhauer's pessimism and this idea of a blind will behind the world of appearances were incredibly influential.
Exactly. Like Nietzsche, for example, he kind of flipped Schopenhauer's concept of the will on its head and proposed the will to power. And Freud incorporated Schopenhauerian ideas into his concept of the unconscious. And even Wittgenstein, with that famous line in the Tractatus about remaining silent about what we cannot speak, echoes in a way Schopenhauer's advocacy for withdrawing from this obscure, incomprehensible will.
It's amazing how his ideas pop up in so many different places.
For those of you listening who might be feeling a little lost in all these philosophical terms, let's clarify a couple of key concepts. One of them is the thing in itself, or das Ding an sich in German.
Oh yeah, the thing in itself, that's a big one.
It is. So Schopenhauer defines it as that which exists independently of our sensory perception, the ultimate reality. For Democritus, it was matter. For Locke, too. Kant called it an unknowable X, and for Schopenhauer, it was the will.
So think of it like this. Imagine a table. The way we see the table is just the representation. The thing in itself would be what the table actually is at its most fundamental level, independent of how we perceive it.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer argues that we have access to this thing in itself through our own bodily experience. We perceive our bodies as representation, but we're also aware of our desires or urges. That's the manifestation of the will within us. And he extends that understanding to the rest of the material world, saying that everything that exists is, at its core, this blind, unceasing will.
Makes you look at the world a little differently, huh?
It does. And this view even extends to how Schopenhauer views death. He sees it as a return to our original state, the state of the thing in itself, where all our brain-based knowledge, which only deals with the world of appearances, becomes superfluous. He uses some pretty vivid analogies, like a cured cripple throwing away his crutches or Greenlanders who couldn't imagine a paradise without doors. For him, death is like waking up from a dream where individuality belongs to the dream and the return is to our fundamental essence.
Heavy stuff.
No doubt. And lastly, it's worth mentioning Schopenhauer's pretty negative view of the state. He saw it as something that arises from egoism and exists to serve it, not to promote morality.
So basically not a fan of big government.
Not really. For him, true freedom lies beyond the world of phenomena and human arrangements. He saw the state as a kind of collective egoism, dealing with all those individual egoisms to ensure the common good, but not necessarily based on any genuine moral principles.
Interesting. So to sum it all up, Schopenhauer's big idea is this view of life has an endless cycle of dissatisfaction and suffering, driven by this blind will that can never be satisfied. But in the midst of this kind of gloomy picture, he does offer some glimmers of hope through art, compassion, and a deeper understanding of how reality actually works.
Exactly. So for those of you listening, take a moment to reflect on this. Does Schopenhauer's perspective make you see your own experiences of desire, frustration, and those rare, fleeting moments of joy in a new light? Does his view, despite being pessimistic, offer any kind of comfort or understanding?
And to leave you with one last thought to ponder, consider this. If our individual consciousness is just a temporary manifestation of this fundamental indifferent will, how does that change the way we view the value and meaning of our individual lives and actions? Is there a kind of freedom in accepting this reality, or does it force us to search for meaning beyond the individual? Think about it. And until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.
Keep diving, everyone.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.